the suffrage movement. And women, Jewish women, have been a part of every movement, every women's rights movement. We won't get into the Women's March, but, and I'm speaking there next week, so not the national, but we've been a part of it. And you know what? In the 70s, we faced the same anti-Semitism we face today, and we need to still be there. We need to be out there and double down and educate people. I mean, this morning, I spent 30 minutes arguing with a friend of mine about anti-Semitism and racism and Louis Farrakhan, but we need to be in it. If we're not in it, we're not engaging, we're not growing, we're not passing through it. So, but yes, suffrage was a monumental moment, yes.
My grandmother was involved as a labor leader in destroying the sweatshops.
Yes, okay, so the labor movement, these great movements of building power. So tomorrow we're going to talk about how we create social change in a lecture entitled Bagels and Bacon. We do social justice in a Christian world. Obviously, we're not having bagels and bacon tomorrow, though if you do that, you can have it before you come. That would be fine. I don't know the kashrut laws of Temple Beth Am, or the customs. All right, so, yes. Monumental, that buildings would be made in such a way that you could enter if you were differently abled. Right? Any way where there are systemic issues that oppress in society, we've created laws that overcome those systemic issues. That's what it means to do civic engagement, to say, how can we create exist not just for the person we're talking to, but for the systems, and that's what civic engagement is. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we got to get to the Song of the Sea. Yes?
Napoleon breaking down the ghettos
in
Europe.
All right. Wonderful. Getting out of the ghettos and having equal rights as Jews.
Law 94-142. It happens that the founder of my school, Francis McLennan, testified before Congress that kids and adults with disabilities deserve all the support that can be given from kindergarten up through university.
Wonderful. That there wouldn't be educational impediments to those with who are differently able to academically or any way. Yes?
Rosa Parks saying, I'm tired, I'm not moving.
And she wasn't old at all. She was like in her 40s. She was sick and tired of the situation. All right, let's in the back, and then we're going to move on. Sorry. The Soviet Jewry, amazing, the liberation. So these were all redemptive moments. January 27th, the liberation of Auschwitz was a redemptive moment. These are all, Okay. So these are all liberation moments, really critical. And what was the emotion felt? We're not going to answer that, but exhilaration, awe, excitement, disbelief. Like, how do you work so hard and all of a sudden the seas are parted and you get those rights for which you have fought for so long? Whether it was the breaking down of the ghetto walls or the ability to vote or desegregation of schools, whatever it was. What? Okay, so these are monumental moments, and they call us to sing out in song. And that was the moment at the Song of the Sea, right? After centuries of slavery, we finally made it. The Egyptians were drowning, and we were on the other side. And so we sang this song that you can see so beautifully laid out on the front page of your document at the top, or on page 488. So the Song at the Sea, how many have seen this in the actual Torah? How many have seen what the Song at the Sea looks like, Song of the Sea? So the Torah is written in columns, and all of a sudden you get to the Song of the Sea. You can find it in any Torah, even if you don't read Hebrew. You just roll the Torah, and when you get to a part that looks like bricks, you'll know you're at the Song of the Sea. And then there's one other song at the end of the Torah, Ha'azinu, which is written in 2 columns. So I want to read you a midrash to talk about it for a minute, and then we're going to look at the Song of the Sea and compare it to crossing over the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. So the midrash teaches that Torah, it's on your page on the right side, the midrash teaches that Torah was given as black fire on white fire. On the simplest level, black fire reflects the letters, And white fire reflects the spaces between the letters. Black fire represents the literal meaning. White fire is the interpretation. Black fire is limited and fixed. The white fire is limitless and ever-growing. Our written Torah holds within it our potential, including our potential to learn. So if you look at the Song of the Sea, either in your Plout commentary or on your handout, what do you notice about the layout? Why do you think the layout is different than any other layout in the Torah?
Poetic.
Poetic. So it's a different genre. We could look at what was around in ancient Near Eastern cultures. It's poetic. We could look at what songs meant, victory songs. Clearly, a victory song after a military success, and it was led by a woman, very, very important. She led that military success. So we have the Song of Deborah, and very important at the end of the song, which I didn't highlight, but since we're talking about the suffrage movement, Miriam sings her song. So women sing and men sing, and we are celebrating. So it's poetic. Why else do you think this song is laid out in such a fashion?
Divided in 3 columns, and it's looks like it's referring to the before, the during, and the future.
Okay, so it's sort of reflecting on the whole journey across the sea. So in your mind, we see 3 columns, and it's giving a different message than straight across. We need to think about the different components.
I see this as opening spaces for the Israelites to walk through.
Mm-hmm.
Just as they walk through the Sea of Reed, this spacing in this poem gives us the ability to walk through and really hear all the words and all the essences there.
Wonderful, beautiful, yes.
I see it as a call and response. The leader says the first line and everybody else responds to it.
Sort of like last night singing, right? They were not going to stop till we were all totally in it. When we go to a black church, and we might next year celebrate MLK at a black church, but every song goes on really long. You're so tired by the end of your 2 hours in church. But everyone needs to be involved, and perhaps the song in its origin was getting everyone engaged in the music and in the rejoicing.
To me, it's just a reminder that we used to make bricks in Egypt.
Absolutely. So there are a lot of commentaries who say that it's laid out like the bricks, slab, brick, slab, brick, so we remember that experience.
In the Kabbalah, there are 58 blanks, the entire parsha, which corresponds to the word hen, which is like graciousness. But there are 45 blanks actually in the poem itself, which corresponds to God's name in the word Adam.
Wonderful, beautiful. Did you get that? So the number of blank spaces, according to mysticism, one reflect the word chen. Chen is like utmost compassion, right? Grace. That God, out of grace, chen v'chesed v'rachamim, we sing that on the high holidays, or even on Shabbat, that notion of God's grace, that we're somehow, God redeemed us even when we might not have been worthy of redemption so much. And then the second one is God's name, the many names for God, you said, is that God is ever present, and God's beyond our ability to even pronounce God's name. So the spaces are that space of God's name. The God's name in Hebrew, the tetragrammaton, the ineffable name of God is Yud He Vav He, right? It's all air sounds, Yehovah, right? It is breath. So really, I think, rather than give God a name, we should just breathe, because our souls go back to God after we die. We know someone's died. We know when we're sitting with them, when they stop breathing, that's the end of their life. Their soul, God breathes into us the breath of life, and our soul goes back to God, in my belief. And we are connected to God through breath. So I actually think we should just, say, blessed are you, and just not bother naming God, because we should just breathe and experience God rather than naming God. And the beautiful thing about God's name is it has all states of being. Haya, the past, Yud He Vav He, has the word Haya, what was past, has the word Hoveh, what is present, has the word Yehiyah, what is future. That not only are we connected to God through our breath, but God is eternal. God is beyond time. So the space might actually, beautiful teaching, represent God's name. That we stop and celebrate all the aspects of God that one can experience in the world. Any other insights? And then I'll share with you some of the traditional ones and we'll move on.
So just the colors, black, white, mm-hmm. Darkness to light, which is, iconic in the Haggadah. And it's just, to really appreciate freedom, we know where we come from and we really can support it.
Okay, so there's darkness and light. And we experience darkness and light, and there's darkness and light in our world. And how do we experience both and bring about more light in the world? So I'm going to share with you just a handful of traditional. I could have given you an 8-page packet on Midrashim on the song, but I really wanted to study Heschel and King, and I've never done this Torah study on Heschel and King, and I want to see how it goes. So I'm going to just summarize. You don't have these Midrashim. I'm going to summarize what some of the traditional commentators have said really quickly. First of all, on this poem, Moses calls out to God, right, and says, help us. What do we do? And what does God say? Why are you crying out to me? Speak to the Israelites. Let them move on. Raise your staff, stretch out your hand, and split over the sea and split it. So God says, why are you crying out to me? Ask God, this is no time for prayer. My people are suffering. So there's a time for prayer, and there's a time to just get moving, right, and part the seas ourselves. It's not going to happen if we just wait for God to do it. It's not how we got the state of Israel. That's not how any of the changes that you mentioned, any of the liberation movements, did not happen. Maybe God helped as a partner, but people were needed to take those steps forward. So I believe God gives us the strength, but we can't pray to God to do it. I think you probably know the story of the man in the flood. Do you know that one? Yeah. So there's a flood, and they came to save him on rescue boat. He said no. They came to save him, somebody knocked on his door. He said no. Somebody came in a boat. He said no. They came on plane. He said no. Gets up to heaven and faces God and said, why didn't you save me in the face of the flood? And God said, I sent 3 people to save you. So we need to be partners in redemption. The next one is just, you don't have these here, but I'm just giving you a little summary. We have the story of Nachshon ben Aminadab. Do you know that story? So nobody wanted to jump into the waters, right? They said, I'm not going, you go in, right? Who's going to have courage to step in those waters and let them part? And everyone looked at their neighbor saying, you go in, and you go in. And Nachshon jumped into the waters, and the waters came up to his throat, and he said, Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai. The first time it's mi chamocha, and the second time we say it, it's mi kamocha. So why is it ch and then k? Because why is it a chaf and a kaf? Because Nachshon jumped into the waters. The waters were going up to his throat. He couldn't say mi kamocha. He said mi chamocha. And then the waters parted. He said, who is like you, O God? And he said, mi kamocha. And so sometimes we sit on the side and we say, God, I'm not going to believe in God till that miracle comes, right? Till I'm cured, till I'm redeemed. I'm just not believing in God. But the message of this midrash is that we have to jump into the waters, express our belief, and then those miracles will happen. We can't just sit aside waiting for them to happen. A third midrash is about the mud. It's a later midrash. Do you know the midrash about the mud? So, when you're hiking and you're not in front hiking, and sometimes you can't see everything because you're following upon the heels of the person in front of you? Well, the story is that they were going through the sea, and some of the Israelites totally missed the miracle. They were complaining about the mud. They said, look at this mud, it's ruining my shoes. What kind of leadership is this? And they never looked up and saw the miracle of the parting of the sea. And the spaces between the lines also teach us that there are limits to our praise of God. There are limits to how we can praise God. We can't fully praise God because it's beyond our ability to articulate our true gratitude for moments, for great moments. And that is another reason behind the spaces between the words. We know songs are incredibly important. That's how we remember, through songs. We're taken back in time through song. We hear a song on the radio from the 60s or the 70s or the 80s, or I don't know how far back you all go, 50s, 40s, whatever, 30s, yes. Okay, your high school, you're brought back to different times and spaces and events through song.
Vinyl records.
Yeah, and then vinyl records, and they're coming back, so we love them. Another thing about the song, which I mentioned last year, it's Az Yashir. What are the first words of the song? Can anybody find it in English? What does it say? I will sing in the future. I will sing in the future. Then Moses and the Israelites sang this song, I will sing to the Az Yashir Moshe Ubnei Yisrael et Shirah Hazot. And it's in the future. And Moses and Israel will sing this song. Now, tenses are strange in the Torah. Tenses, you can use past tense and future tense. It's not definitive. But it's in the future, which leads the rabbis to say it's a messianic allusion. Right? It's a reference to the Messiah, a future day, that the ultimate redemption hasn't come. And we know this with all the laws that were passed. Whenever a monumental thing happens, like the dismantling of apartheid, it takes a lot of work to get from there to not having a civil war in South Africa, right? We needed truth and justice, a truth and reconciliation process. It doesn't just happen when marriage rights are passed or when voting rights are passed or Brown versus Board of Education affirms that the separate but equal is not equal, and we need to desegregate the schools. So that happened in 54, but still in the 60s, well into the 60s and into the early 70s, and today, we are still working on desegregating the schools. So just passing through the sea isn't enough. And I am telling you, we lobby. I have an organization. I'm at Queen's University of Charlotte. It's a small institution in Charlotte. So first of all, if you know any kids looking for colleges who want, we have a rabbi and a director of Jewish life. We're 1,500 students. It's really cute, quaint. I know all my students really well. But we run at my center. I teach Jewish studies to the community and on campus, and I'm rabbi to Hillel. And we have a Holocaust and human rights component, but we also do social justice. Because it's not enough to just study the past and the inequities and the threats to democracy. We need to work on them now. So when I work on affordable housing and city council agrees to something, we have to stay on top of them, because if we don't, they don't follow through on what they actually voted and said they would do. So it's not enough to just pass the laws. We need to continue to make sure they are enforced. And so Moses says, the Israelites said, we will sing. The ultimate time is not here. So let's look at the next three photos. I think that covered all the midrashim. See, there are three photos on your packet. Does anybody know what the photos are on the front page of your packet? Okay, what's the first top one? Selma. Selma, the march from Selma to Montgomery for voting rights. So it was a Selma to Montgomery march. There were three marches. If you can watch Selma and get see the movie. There were actually three marches. The first march was on Bloody Sunday. It was on March 7th, 1965. They were heading to Montgomery to vote. And what happens? The law enforcement used clubs and tear gas and dogs and beat them up. And so if you do an amazing trip is a Deep South pilgrimage to do with an African American church, to get on a bus, to go to Atlanta and Selma and Montgomery and Memphis and study this history together. And you get to the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and you'll hear from people who are on that bridge, passed out, and it was just a devastating moment. And then there was a second march on March 9th, 65, and Martin Luther King was leading that march, and they were going over the bridge, and law enforcement was on the other side, and he made a decision to turn back and head back to the church where they started their organizing. And then there was the third march on March 21st, 65. Here, 25,000 came together to march, and the National Guard protected them, and they indeed marched. That is why we are needed. That is why we are needed. If African Americans are marching alone, if there's a protest, God forbid there's a police shooting and it's uncertain the circumstances and people are upset, understandably. They've lost a lot of people. The African American, there are a lot of moms who, somebody gave me a card last night. She runs an organization for mothers, not African American, for mothers who've lost their children at the hands of police. So it's really important. I keep in my trunk my stuff to march or to be at a protest, my prayer shawl and my shoes, so that I can be ready in case if there is something, I get a message on my phone and we go uptown. Because if we're not there, it's more tense, right? Just our being there, just our being at this march made a difference. And so we need to stand with our neighbors across lines of difference. So crossing over the Edmund Pettus Bridge is likened to crossing through the sea. We're going to think about how they compare. Now, what are the other two photos? Anybody know? The left photo, what's on? So you have the bridge. What's to the left of the bridge?
Heschel.
That's Abraham Joshua Heschel starting that march with Martin Luther King Jr. and several other leaders of the movement. And then on the right side, what's that last photo? Anybody know? Birmingham. And what happened in Birmingham? And they trained the children. The children were trained day after day after day after school to protest, in nonviolent protest. And they were attacked with fire hoses and tear gas and dogs. And that was the turning point of the movement, where nationally on news we could see what was happening. They left school. They actually were going to be expelled, but luckily they were not, or suspended. But it was the kids. It was the kids who led the march. And when we think about Parkland and what the kids did, our job is to support them, to teach them how to use their voice in democracy, how to create change, to empower them to listen and learn and build power to make the differences we need to make. So how would you say, just in a minute, crossing over the Edmund Pettus Bridge was like crossing through the sea? And how was it not like it? Do you think it was like it, or do you think it was different? What ways was it the same, and what ways was it different?
Well, in both cases, they faced possible death by either drowning or shooting.
Right. Okay. So it was life-threatening. It was truly life-threatening crossing over the seas or the river.
I see it in a physical sense as coming from a constricted space that's Ryan.
Right.
With collective effort across an abyss and into what is hopefully more promising, a more promising space.
So coming through a narrow place. Mitzrayim comes from the word sar. And it's interesting. There's Reb Nachman of Bratslav says, the whole world is a very narrow bridge. Gesher tsar me'od. It's a very narrow bridge, and the most important thing is not to be afraid. So they're coming through a bridge to that redemption, which is voting rights. Amazing opportunity to have your say in who will be your leader.
It's how we were born, how we came through a narrow canal.
We're born like that, right? We're born through a narrow, why? That's crazy, but that's a beautiful, so it is a rebirth that comes with freedom. The rebirth of, the liberation after the Holocaust. The greatest increase in births, the most births and weddings was in Bergen-Belsen, the DP camp, the displaced persons camp. They had so many, they took a parachute and made it into a wedding dress, and people used the wedding dress day after day after day. You had no family, so you turned to the person next to you and said, let's get married. And they got married, and they had kids, and what faith in the future. So there are births, little births, which is very redemptive, and then there are births of nations, or births of futures, or rebirths of our people with emancipation and enlightenment and in coming to America.
I think we have to look at the circumstances. The Hebrews were running from their enemies. In this case, here in our own country, they should have been protected by law.
Right.
What they were marching for. I think there's a tremendous difference on that score. They shouldn't have had to.
They shouldn't have had to, right? And so that's a perfect segue into Heschel and King and the metaphors that they used for the civil rights, the language that they used. So we're going to move right to who was the Pharaoh here, what's the analogy? Did you want to add?
When I think of Heschel, I've read a number of his things, and he said, pray with your feet.
Okay, yes, he said,
Do something.
okay, he said in, so when he marched in Selma, he left. He was a professor of mysticism at the Jewish Theological Seminary. First of all, he's a Holocaust refugee. So many of our great leaders in that era are Holocaust refugees. My dad was a Holocaust refugee, and I'll talk a little bit about that right after as part of my Devar Torah. But so Heschel went down south, and they asked him about the experience, and he wrote a piece that my legs were praying. When I talk to Reformed Jews, or a lot of people say I was praying with my feet. That's what they say. It's a little misquote, but it doesn't matter. The most important thing is that we are praying with our legs and our feet. We're not just praying inside the sanctuary, we're praying out. And Amos is all about that. So we're going to look at Amos, the prophet, and understand why Heschel and King chose Amos and chose Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt. Yes?
In terms of differences, the element of miraculous, I don't think that the civil rights movement or that particular march was miraculous. It was historically inevitable.
It was historically inevitable. Okay, well, I love that. Whereas the Exodus from Egypt was not historically inevitable.
It was imprinted into the DNA of the world by God, but it wasn't a natural act.
So I would say if we believe possibly that Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt, was imprinted in the Bible, then we could likely believe that everything is imprinted, right? Then that's going to happen. But we go back to that phrase, lift up your staff and reach it out and part the seas. It's not going to happen unless we are partners. The Israelites needed to get out of Egypt. They needed to find the courage and the strength and the organizational skills and the leadership to get out of Egypt. So there are Egypts everywhere, and there is an inevitability, but we have to find it, and we have to gain that strength and respond to move forward. So let's go look at Yetziat Mitzrayim. Yetziat Mitzrayim is the Exodus from Egypt. We have on top of page 2 the famous phrase from the Passover Seder. Let's just read this sentence together in Hebrew and English. B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam lirot et atzmo kehilu hu yatsa mimitzrayim. In all generations, it is the duty of man to consider himself as he had come forth from Egypt. Why do we need to remember in every generation and see ourselves as coming forth from Egypt? Why? Why did the Mishnah determine this 2,000 years ago, the rabbis of the Mishnah? Why do we need to see ourselves as coming forth from Egypt? Yes?
I think that was the time that we, as a group, witnessed God.
So we witness God, right? And we had this experience, we forget so easily, right? We forget. The book of Numbers is Sefer HaKvetch. We kvetch so much. And we really experience God's power, so we need to remember. Why? Any other reasons why we need to remember the Exodus? Solidarity with others. Right? That we need to remember others' suffering, and we need to reach out, and we need to honor that, and we need to help redeem that. Yes?
You never want to forget from where you came.
You can't forget where you came from, right? That's a part.
Otherwise, you don't have the capacity to help others who are making that journey.
Right. You get caught up in yourself. All right.
I was going to say have empathy for others.
Good.
Solidarity.
Wonderful. It helps us have empathy. Anybody? Did you have?
I was going to say this, like, if you don't learn the history of man, then you are condemned to repeat its mistakes.
And there are so many great lessons. I'm writing my doctoral thesis on a guy named Tannenbaum, Rabbi Mark Tannenbaum, the father of interfaith dialogue, and I'm going to talk to you in a minute about him. But what is so important is he dealt with these Farrakhan issues that we're seeing in the Women's March. He dealt with this, and he dialogued with people who opposed us. So for me, he brought together the 1963 Conference on Race and Religion, and he created a 1974 conference on the history of Jewish-Black relations. And in the 80s, he debated Jesse Jackson. So I think for me, it helps me figure out how I should respond today by gaining wisdom from the people before us and how they handled these same issues. Yes?
It gives us hope. I think hope that anything is
Okay, so it's important. Hope, yes?
We have to remember that to not only watch change, but to participate in change.
Amen. We became a people at that moment. We turned from a mixed multitude to an actual people. This moment is so important. It's equally important as Sinai. We understood, though, that laws were needed to maintain the freedom. So when we stood at Sinai, we received those laws. There was one more comment on why we need to remember. How do we remember? How do we remember Yetziat Mitzrayim? How do we remember the Exodus from Egypt as Jews? Okay, Seder is a big one. We remember every year at Seder through food for hours, eating. Typical us, right? We remember through all the foods our Exodus from Egypt. What a brilliant idea. We remember it by teaching the Exodus from Egypt. Where else do we mention the Exodus from Egypt? Where is it a part of our lives? Fridays. Fridays, where in the service? The Kiddush. We say Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim. It's a remembrance of our Exodus from Egypt, both Pesach and Shabbat. The Song of the Sea, Mi Chamocha. When do we sing? Anybody traditional grow up in an Orthodox home? When do we sing Mi Chamocha? Twice a day, right? It's part of our daily liturgy. So we are supposed to constantly remember the Exodus from Egypt. It's the most repeated commandment. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. 36 times it's mentioned in the Torah. So it is a part of who we are, of everything that we do. So I went over Exodus 15. We don't need to do that one because it's God saying to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Lift your rod, stretch out your hand, and divide it, and the Israelites will go forth on dry ground. It will be steady ground, right? It's scary, it's overwhelming, it's life-threatening, but it will be steady ground. And then we have Amos. So Martin Luther King and Heschel independently used the exact same quotes at this 1963 conference. And I saw an interesting essay by his daughter that said that had Martin Luther King used a New Testament image of Jesus, they wouldn't have had that close kinship in the same way. So his use of the Exodus, the liberation theology, is really instrumental in their tight relationship. And that's a real interesting study about Black liberation theology and how that guides the African American community. That would be a great lesson to bring Pastor Brooks, is it? Pastor Brooks, to talk to him about what this Yetziat Mitzrayim, this Exodus, means to them as a Black community, an African American community. So let's look at Amos. So anybody know anything about Amos? Okay, good. All right, let's go.
Amos calls himself a shepherd, but he really is from the south, and he's probably a wealthy guy.
Okay, so he's a shepherd, or he's even a wealthy shepherd. He can still make this monumental change. He's in the south. He's from Tekoa, but he's speaking to the north. So he's a prophet, and he's speaking to the north. What is a prophet? Anybody know how a prophet is defined in Judaism? What
He has the word of God.
He speaks the word of God. He's a spokesperson, a mouthpiece, right? So God speaks to the prophet, and the prophet says, this is how it is. Can you think of some other prophets? Who are other prophets we know? Who was that? Samuel was a prophet. It was not an easy job to be a prophet, and he ordained Saul and David. Isaiah, envisioned the exile, the Babylonian exile. So we have 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Isaiah. First Isaiah envisions it. Second Isaiah brings comfort. When I was a rabbi at Beth Am, I had this bumper sticker was behind my desk. I didn't put it on my door. But now that I'm a professor, the bumper sticker's on my door. And it says the job of the prophet is this statement, which actually comes from a newspaper a long time ago. It says, my job is to disturb the comfortable and to comfort the disturbed. And it is on my door because now I'm a professor and I can stir up stuff even more. And the temple was really, really worried because, I love temple, and I was there 18 years, and I'm Rabbi Emerita, and I wrote a eulogy that was delivered yesterday, and I'm there for families, but I have freedom to travel and speak and teach and write. But they were really worried when I was leaving, how I would be using my voice, because I speak my mind, and would it reflect poorly if I spoke out on something radical, which I'm not that radical, My husband's a banker. I'm not that radical, but they see me as radical. And I call my work activism with pearls, right? We put on pearls and we go in the bank. Rather than protest outside, we can protest inside because we have that access. We can do it over dinner and over wine and over golf. But when I was leaving, they created my Emerita contract, the Emerita agreement, what Emerita does and doesn't do. And they were so worried about my using my voice, you know. So I said, first of all, I won't use my Rabbi Emerita title if I'm going to say something that I'll check. It doesn't matter to me. And but the truth is, I've been at Beth Am for 18 years. No matter what I do, people are going to associate me with Beth Am. And secondly, I'm not going to not speak my mind to have the title of Rabbi Emerita, right? I'm leaving to speak my mind. But some people were a little nervous about my voice. But most people were pretty happy with what I that's part of being a rabbi. And it's part of being a prophetic. Jeremiah was beaten up, right? Jeremiah was a prophet who was beaten up. Jonah got the call, and what did he do? He ran the other way, right? Like, I don't want to hear that call. My professor in LA, on her door, she has a cartoon. It says, "Oh no, don't invite Jeremiah to the party," because he's such a negative guy. He's like Eeyore, oh me, oh my, the end of the world is coming. If you don't change your ways, you're doing bad things. And I assure you, you would not have welcomed Amos into this synagogue. All right. Deborah is a prophetess, right? She was a prophetess and she was a military leader. She knew what God wanted, and she said, we need to go to battle now. And Barak said, I'm not going to battle unless you come with me. And she said, if I come with you, the defeat of the enemy army is going to be at the hands of a woman. So great example. So prophets, let me just tell you some fast facts about prophets. Prophets were, generally, they were solitary figures. They were loners. They were God's mouthpieces. They liked to run away from the task. They didn't want it. They were downers. They were God's conscience. They arose in times of social and political crisis. They could predict what would happen if actions weren't followed. They were truth tellers. Moses was a prophet. Prophets spoke truth to power. Nathan told King David what he did wrong. Few are guilty, all are responsible, they taught. And prophets, they did know a life of loneliness and misery largely. So we have Amos here. Amos lived between 775 and 750. He comes from Tekoa, a small town 12 miles from Jerusalem, and he is seeing incredible prosperity in the north in Israel. So the tribes were divided. You had 10 tribes in the north in Israel and 2 tribes in the south, Benjamin and Judah. And the north is prospering and doing really well. But the problem is, as they prosper, they have a policy of benign neglect. As trade expands, a new wealthy class of Israelites emerge. We read reports of people living in winter and summer homes, sleeping in fine beds, inlaid with carved ivory, and anointing themselves with the choicest of oils. We'll call it perfumes today. And unfortunately, the poorer classes do not share in their wealth. If anything, they sink into greater poverty. And we are, it says in Deuteronomy 15, right, that we need to give to the poor sufficiently to meet their needs, right? They should have houses and food and education, the basics. He says that they are being sold into debt. Amos declares the people are in debt. They're being sold as slaves, even when the debt is as small as a pair of shoes. And it says in Exodus that if somebody needs to borrow, they're borrowing money from you and you take their coat as collateral, you need to return it at night so they don't freeze. But what Amos says, that they were not doing it. Amos describes wealthy Jews reclining at the temple's altars on garments taking in pledge. Right? We weren't returning the garments overnight. He is particularly upset that these rich oppressors of the poor are somehow very scrupulous about observing the rituals of the temple. So these rich in the north, who have summer and winter homes, and life is really good, and they got beds with inlaid ivory, they are not even giving back coats at night that they've taken in pledge, and they are being very devout in their ritual offerings. So Amos is saying that that's not okay, right? You can't just pray inside your sanctuary and not act with justice outside the sanctuary. There's this incredible Christian scholar of the Old Testament. His name's Walter Brueggemann. I'd bring him. He's amazing. And he gives a very hard talk on extractive economies. That's what Egypt was. They set up a system during the years of plenty and famine, and people slowly sold off everything they had and became totally indebted to the Egyptian empire. And so he says that there are extractive economies where the wealthy make a lot and extract it from the poor. And it seems that people, the wealthier they are, the more worried they get about what they have. And I'm married to a banker, so I'm not doing this as it's about looking at what we need and what we have. And it's a very intense lecture. You can Google it, but it really makes you think about what we're doing. And he thinks the message of Exodus is really about that. Yes?
The takeaway for me, having watched a similar lecture, was that we can feed the hungry of the world. We can't satisfy the rich.
So it's hard, we have to think about different systems. I'm working a lot on affordable housing right now. And apparently, I'm working with a lot of African-American artists. They're living in their grandparents' homes. It was their grandparents' homes, their parents' homes. They're living in their homes. And all of a sudden, the neighborhoods are being bought up. They live in opportunity zone neighborhoods where there are tax breaks for developing. And all of a sudden, their property values are going up, right? So they won't be able to afford taxes. And then people are knocking on doors saying, we'll give you $100,000 for your home. But if they're given $100,000 for their home, all of a sudden they move, they run out of their money with rent in several years, and they're left with nothing. And their neighborhoods are destroyed. And so how do we prevent that displacement? So then I open an article, and I see it's one of my close friends who's doing all this developing. So I wrote my friends who are artists, these African-American artists, I said, we have to come up with a plan with how we're going to bring developers into the solution. We're getting the banks in the solution. It's one piece of many pieces of the puzzle of affordable housing. But how do we solve these issues together?
It's happening in Miami.
It's happening everywhere. And tomorrow we're going to look at it. And we're going to look at it. And if affordable housing were something we wanted to work on, and we see it nationally, a lot of companies are working on this. We work on many levels, whether it's relationship building or education or thinking, okay, what's a piece of the puzzle where we can make a difference? Yes?
But I believe what Amos is saying is you can pray all you want and pray hard, but if you don't change your habits, it's all for naught.
Yes. So let us look at Amos, the two messages. That's exactly it. He says in 11 and 12, he's talking about the wealth. He said, therefore, because you trample upon the poor and take from him exactions of wheat, you built houses of hewn stone, but you shall not dwell in them. You planted pleasant vineyards, but you shall not drink wine thereof. For I know how manifold are your transgressions, and how mighty your sins. You that afflict the just, that take a ransom, and that turn aside the needy in the gate. And then he says in 21, I despise your feasts, where you come and celebrate for Passover and all your holidays. I will take no delight in your solemn assemblies. I don't want to see you all here at Yom Kippur. Yea, though you offer me burnt offerings and your meal offerings, though you offer me kol nidre and you offer me ni'ilah, I will not accept them. Neither will I regard peace offerings, your donations, your very extensive donations, your offerings of your fat beasts, your offerings of your investments and your proceeds and your income. Take the noise of your songs. I don't want to hear your MLK songs. They're really beautiful, but I don't want to hear that. Let me not hear the melody of your psalteries, but let justice well up like waters and righteousness as a mighty stream. Okay, you want to comment? It's powerful stuff. And I don't think it's that God doesn't want that. And Heschel and King are not saying that God doesn't want our songs. But what God is saying is God doesn't want that in place of our actions. We can't relieve our guilty conscience by coming here and offering our prayers of forgiveness. Yes, in the back.
So I have a good friend who is an alcoholic and he's been sober for like 30 years. He works So that's, to me, in our modern day world, kind of like...
And what's so overwhelming, literally would take every food we eat, we need to think about where it comes from and the farmers and the workers, and we can't do it all, right? I finish my talk tomorrow, the bagels and bacon talk. You finish the task, complete the task, but neither are you free to desist from working on it. So pick something that is your passion and know it and learn it and make a difference and pick up a piece of the puzzle and put it in place to solve that puzzle. But yes, it's hard to walk it all the time, but we have to at least try to walk it as much as we can in everything that we do.
And as Amos was a prophet, he was also predicting the future, whereas the 10 tribes ended up getting conquered and assimilated with the conquerors, and the 2 tribes that were in the south were able to escape and keep the Jewish traditions.
Mm-hmm. So he saw what was happening, and the 10 tribes indeed were in 722, shortly after Amos's predictions. They were dispersed and exiled, and so he was that kind of prophet. So let's move on, just so we can cherish the words of Abraham Joshua Heschel and Martin Luther King. So can I, well, this is really interesting. So we have a really rich archives of Dr. King. We have archives. These are his notes from graduate school in Boston on this verse in Amos. Okay? So Dr. King, he wrote on the bottom of page 2, in his on a note card, index card, this passage might be called a key passage in the entire book. It reveals the deep ethical need. God is a God that demands justice rather than sacrifice, righteousness rather than ritual. The most elaborate worship is but an insult to God when offered by those who have no mind to conform to its ethical demands. Certainly, this is one of the most noble ideas ever uttered by the human mind. One may raise the question as to whether Amos was against all ritual and sacrifice worship. I think not. He's not against it, Amos. It seems to me that Amos's concern is the ever-present tendency to make ritual and sacrifice a substitute for ethical living. Unless a man's heart is right, Amos seems to be saying the external worship mean nothing. God is a God that demands justice and sacrifice can never, God is a God that demands justice and sacrifice can never be a substitute for it. Who can disagree with such a Social ethics, this is his next note. Amos's emphasis throughout seems to be that justice between man and man is one of the divine foundations of society. Such an ethical idea is at the root of all religion. The high ethical notion conceived by Amos must always remain a challenge to the Christian church, and I would add, the Jewish synagogue. So he's saying we have two types of mitzvot. You can divide but you into ritual mitzvot, ben adam l'makom, an ethical mitzvot between one and another. And he's saying that mitzvot between human beings are one of the divine foundations. So as important, if not more. So now here's the moment between Heschel and King. He was a rabbi ordained in the Jewish Theological Seminary where King was teaching. And he was a student, fifth-year student. He's in the elevator. He just got news that his dad had a heart attack. He's devastated. Heschel sees him, sees he's distressed, invites him to his office. Tannenbaum is in the office. His mother. Rabbi Tannenbaum graduates, JTS. He goes to work for a publisher. He publishes Abraham Joshua Heschel's first book. You know, he proceeds. Tannenbaum and Heschel. read the very top two paragraphs. So it's on page 3, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Here for it.
Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, religion and for Pharaoh and Moses. Moses' words were, "Thus says the Lord, let my people go." Then I should heed his voice and let Israel go. I do not know the Lord, and Moses let Israel go. The outcome of that summit, Pharaoh is not ready to capitulate. In fact, it was easier for the children of Israel to cross the Red Sea than for a Negro to university campus.
Okay, good. Let's move on to the next. We have another reader for the. Okay.
What is the essence of being a prophet? A prophet is a person who holds God and men in one thought, at one time, at all times. Our tragedy begins with the segregation of God, with the bifurcation of the secular and sacred. We worry more about the purity of dogma than about the integrity of love. We think of God in the past tense and refuse to realize that God is always present and never past, that God may be more intimately present in slums than in mansions with those who are smarting under the abuse of the power. There are, of course, many among us whose record in dealing with the Negroes and other minority groups is unspotted. However, an honest estimation of the moral state of our society will disclose some are guilty, but all are responsible.
Okay, so first of all, he is the Pharaoh and the Moses imagery and the crossing through the sea. And then he says, we might say, okay, I'm okay just in and of myself. I'm doing good. I'm not oppressing with my own actions, but we're responsible for our society. Right? There are 4 players in an act of oppression in Holocaust studies. We have the victim, we have the persecutor, we have the bystander, and the upstander. Right? And bystanders are responsible. Right? Some are guilty, but all are responsible. All right, let's read the final text, his use. So he deals with the prophet, the concept of being a prophet. He deals with Pharaoh and the Exodus and crossing through the sea. And now he's going to address Amos and expand upon Amos. So can I have a reader to share his Amos quote in the back?
In the words of the prophet Amos, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream expressive of the vehemence of a never-ending, searching, fighting movement, as if obstacles had to be washed away for justice to be done. No rock is so hard that water cannot pierce it, but the mountain crumbles away, and the rock is removed from its place. The waters wear away its stones. Justice is not a mere norm, but a fighting challenge, a restless drive. Righteousness, as a mere tributary feeding the immense stream of human interest, is easily exploited and more easily. The world, the torrent, and introduce and majesty. The surge is choked, the sweep is blocked, yet the mighty will die.
We're just going to stop right there. And now we're going to, so you saw his use of Amos and his, you can't treat justice as a mere tributary into a stream of human interests, right? It's got to roll forth like a mighty stream and roll down like waters. Now, and if you were to do a Deep South pilgrimage and go to Montgomery, this is part of a beautiful memorial there of all the people who died in the civil rights struggle. And then I Have a Dream speech in August 1963. It was at that conference on race and religion in January that the idea for the March on Washington was created. So we're going to close with these words. Martin Luther King in his famous I Have a Dream speech, and there was a rabbi who spoke before him. You can Google and hear it. It's an amazing speech, Rabbi Joachim Prince. But this is Martin Luther King's words. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied as long as our bodies, heavy with fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the cities. We cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from smaller ghetto to larger ghetto. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating for whites only. We cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and the Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. I end with the bottom quote, Az Yashir Moshe Ubnei Yisrael Eta Shira Hazot, and Moses and the children of Israel will sing this song. And Martin Luther King says, and when this happens, and when we allow freedom ring, and when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all God's children, black and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual together, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. Shabbat Shalom. Thanks.